Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we are going to see how to fix memory leaks in JavaScript as well as React.js projects for API calls. So we are going to use a simple website, so a simple app where we have two buttons. One is load data and one is unknown component. Let's try to see in code what these buttons mean. So I'm going to shift into the actual API example. So let's just say we have a load data method or a load data button, and there is an ID with load button, and we are using that ID to have a click listener here, which is load button, and we have an add event listener which is used to add click listeners to buttons in JavaScript, and we have a flag here which is this component mounted flag, a flag to check whether a particular div let's just say is mounted or not. Initially it is set to false, and if it is not mounted, that is the div is not mounted, then we call a special function which is fetch data component. What does fetch data component do? So fetch data component is basically a component where we have a component div with document.create element div. Then we have a component ID, which is data component, which is assigned to this div. Then we go to the component container, which is a div which is present below these two buttons, which is component container. And within this component container, we attach the div. So basically, we are attaching a div by creating it and assigning it ID and attaching it to the component container div. Then we set the component mounted flag to true because we have attached the div and we have mounted the component. Then we call a dummy fetch data function. So fetch data function is, let's just say, a function to fetch some API data. And in that fetch data API, we have a promise which has a set timeout method with a delay of 5 seconds. And it is resolving with some message. For example, let's just say fetch data from API. Once the promise is resolved, if the component is mounted, we check whether the component is mounted. And if it is mounted, then in the component which we just created, we add the data. And if there is some exception, we catch the exception and we console.error the exception, a basic fetch data call. Now, if we click on load data, and if we wait for 5 seconds, let's just say 5 seconds, we should see the data. So as you can see, we have fetch data from API. And if we click on inspect, we have a data component, and it has the data which is resolved from the promise. Now there is an unmount component button. Let's just see what it does. So in the unmount component button, we have a click listener again. And on clicking on this unmount button, what we do is we take the div, we select the div using the ID which we just added to the component div, which is the data component, and we remove it from the DOM using the remove method. So dot remove method is used to remove some element from the DOM. So we remove the element from the DOM, and we set the is component mounted flag to false. So if I click on this button, observe what happens to the data component div and the text here. So we click here. As you can see, the div vanished from here and the text vanished as well. So the div is getting removed. Now let's just say there is a real use case example where I click on load data and the API has been fetched and I click on unmount component. Now what will happen is the load data will finish after 5 seconds because it has a set timeout method. But the data is fetched from the API call, but it has no div to attach itself to. So if we check the flag here, that is the is component mounted. So the promise will get resolved. And since the flag is not present, the component div.inner.html will not work and the data will not get added to the inner HTML. And the API fetch which happened now doesn't have any real use case or the real need, or it is been wasted. So how do we fix this? So, and why do we need to fix this in the first place? There are use cases where people sometimes do a lot of stuff on the web pages and they switch between different components, and those components have some API calls running in the background. For example, there might be a polling API which runs every 5 seconds to refresh the data and so on and so forth. Now, let's just say if this polling API keeps on working even after the component is unmounted, there will be unnecessary API calls running in the background, and we have a memory leak in that case because the server resources are getting wasted and the browser resource getting wasted as well. So this is the classic example where a memory leak is happening because API call is happening on an unmounted component or for an unmounted component. So how do we fix this? So for fixing this in JavaScript, we have a special function, and that function is called abort controller. So abort controller is basically an API which is used to signal the API fetch the method which is responsible for API call, which is fetch method, to tell the API call that, hey, the need for this API call on the front end is done for, and you need to preemptively finish this API call, abort this API call, and stop whatever it has been done for this API request in your thread and release all the memory. So this is how it works. So first we define a controller variable. Then we define a new abort controller using the new abort controller, and there is a signal. If it is if the API has been aborted, there is a flag within the signal which is set to true. Initially it's set to false because the API is not aborted. But for if some reason the API gets aborted, then the aborted flag turns to true and signals to tab that okay, the API has been aborted and the API resources are been they are not dispatched and they are released. So that's the signals method. And if we have a controller and if we execute the abort method dot abort method on this controller, this abort controller, then the API calls get aborted preemptively. So that's the signal call. And how does this happen? So this signal method that you have is passed to the fetch API. And if you search for fetch API MDN, in the MDN docs, you will find a special flag. So most of us are aware with fetch API, but not many of us are aware about the signal flag. So let me just have the signal ready. So this is a signal property, and the signal property signifies to the fetch that okay, there is some issue and we need to abort preemptively. So that's the working of the API. Now let's try to understand this with our own example. So I'm going to open another HTML here, which has the abort controller written. So I'm going to split it towards the right. So this is the API call that we had. The changes that we did here was we first added a abort controller here, which is a variable. The next thing that we did was in the fetch data component, what we did was we initialized the abort controller variable with new abort controller. So this is the abort controller that we have. So let me just open the fixed example. And if you log the abort controller in the console, so let me just click on load data. And this is the abort controller that I was talking about. And it has a signal method. And that signal has a flag which is aborted. So this aborted flag tells whether the API has been fetched or it has been aborted. So that's the abort controller. The next thing that we do is we extract the signal from abort controller and we pass it to our fetch function. So in this case, the fetch data is our API fetch function. So we pass the signal. And here we don't have a fetch API. So what we are doing is we are just taking the signal value. After 3 seconds or after let's just say 5 seconds, let me just change this to 5 seconds to our confusion. Within this 5 seconds, if the signal value gets true by any chance, or the aborted flag within the signal gets true by any chance, we reject the API and we pass the DOM exception, that is the API has been aborted and we don't want to continue with it. And this reject is passed to the inner HTML here and we log the value. So this exception will not run in this promise because we are throwing an exception. It will go into the catch and will print out console.log fetch aborted due to unmarked. Let's see this in example. So we'll hit refresh. I click on load data and I click on unmount component and I wait for 5 seconds. So after 5 seconds, we should see a log that the API got aborted and we got a fetch aborted due to unmounting. So that's the working of the abort control. So this is how we can save some necessary resources and within those 5 seconds, if the API gets unmounted by any reason, for example, with button click or anything, then the whatever successful requests that are present in our case, those get preemptively stopped. This is especially useful in case of video playback because there is a lot of data being transferred. And if user switches to some other video or does some other stock task on the page, then we can stop the API call and we can stop the video playback immediately or preempt before the component gets unmounted. So that's the working of abort controller to fix memory leaks. So this was the example in JavaScript. Let me just show you how the abort controller got aborted. So in the unmount component, that is on clicking of the unmount button, after setting the flag to false, we are also setting the abort controller or abort method. So this will signal to the abort controller that hey, the API has been aborted, and that is how after the set timeout method we have a signal value here. So if you check the signal value here, initially it was set to it is initially set to false in the load data And if I click on unbound component, so then it's set to true and it gets aborted. So if we hit refresh, if we click load data immediately, so initially it is set to false. I click on unbound component, so it is set to true and we got the abort. So this is how the abort controller basically works using the signal API. Now let's try to see this in an actual framework-based code because unmounting mainly happens in various frameworks. So the example that we are going to see is a React-based mini project. So let's just switch from JavaScript to React. So this is a React-based component, and let's just go to the index.html. We have a root, then we have an app.jsx where we have a post component. First, let me just show you the UI. So this is the UI. We have a button here, which is the hide post, and it has a state variable which is set using the show post. Initially, it is set to true. So we have the value as set to true. That is where the button text is hide post. Now, if the value is true, then we show the post component. Now, what is within the post component? Let's just check. First, we have an h1 tag with post, which is an h1, which is the post. Then what we are doing is we are making an actual API call to this online API. This is a free open source API, JSON placeholder. So let's just see what it contains. So basically, it contains list of 1020 posts, and there's a title here, which is been written an array of titles and body. So we are showing that to the end user. We are just showing the titles from the fetch post. So how is that happening? So we have a post written here. Then we in the use effect, we have an empty dependency array that is called this API initially, like once the component is mounted. We have a fetch post function, which is being called after 3 seconds of component gets mounted. And within that fetch post, we are making the API call. We are taking the data. And if the component is mounted, that is, if there is a flag which is called as in mounted, initially it is set to true. If it is true, then we set the post and we show the post to the end user. If there is some error, we show error fetching post. Now, this post data that we have is stored into a state variable called post. We have a set post method which is setting the post. Initially it is empty. Once the post data is fetched, it gets populated into the post array, and that array is shown to the end user using map. So if I hit refresh here, it will show loading for the first 3 seconds. Then the API call will happen, and the post will get shown to the end user. Now again, what happens is in the app.jsx, this button that we have, this is setting a flag which is called show post. And if we hit refresh and while the API has been loading, if we click hide post button, then the show post flag gets set to false and the post component gets unmounted. But the post component was initially mounted, and since we click of the button, that is when we click on this button, the show post API gets unmounted, and the API call still happens, but it happens and it is then being stored into memory, and that is why this is a memory leak. That is, the API call happened even after the component got unmounted and the server resources got wasted. And this can be optimized. This is a very minute optimization, but it is a good optimization. That is, the API call can get optimized using an abort controller. So what we do is we use the abort controller here. So this is a abort controller example. So what we do is different in this case is, in this case, in the use effect, we have the controller. So the controller is first set to abort controller. So abort controller is getting imported from MDN internally. Then in the fetch API call, we pass the signal, which is the controller signal. We pass this signal to let the fetch API know to abort the API call. And if the API gets aborted preemptively, that is, if the component is getting unmounted, the return function from the use effect will get called. So if you know use effect with empty dependency array, you know that when the API is unmounted, the return function from the use effect gets called, and within that we pass the controller.abort. So basically, this will abort the API call in between before the component gets unmounted, and the abort controller will stop the fetch call, and the signal will get passed to the fetch API, and the API call will not happen, or the resources that are being assigned to the API call will get released immediately internally, and the memory leak will get fixed. So this is how the memory leak gets fixed. Now, in case of React, since we are using the actual API call, and there is no mechanism that I at least thought of which can stop the API call from happening. Like this is a live API and it gets completed immediately. So within this 3 seconds, even if I click the button immediately, the API call will still happen and it will get completed in milliseconds. So the abort controller functionality can't be demonstrated directly, but you need to know that if the component gets unmounted like this, for example, if there is a video playback playing instead of the API call, it is taking a lot of time to get the API. And within that time, if the component gets unmounted, then the support controller will surely work and it will stop the API call and it will preemptively stop the API and the resources will get released. So this was a simple and short tutorial of how to use abort controllers to stop the API calls in JavaScript and in React and to optimize the memory utilization in JavaScript and to prevent the memory leaks using abort controller during API call initialization. So yeah, this was a simple and short tutorial. Hope you found this tutorial useful. If you have any feedback or suggestions, then write them down in the comments. If you know some way to delay the API call in the React app, let me know. I will cover it in the future React video. Like this video if you found this video insightful or useful, and subscribe to the channel for more such content in future. That's it from my end for today. Thank you. Have a nice day. Goodbye.